Chapter 2, and an equally peculiar request. The very next day, the first sight that greeted me when I entered the guild was that of a panicked Sheila. Wasting no time, she quickly approached.
And rent.
Wait. Sheila seemed adequately unsettled. I was here to check up on the state of the carcass and to settle some other, more minor issues, but I had a feeling Sheila wasn't distraught about either of these issues. What is it? I asked. We should talk about it over here. Sheila led me to one of the rooms toward the back of the guild's general reception area. The room was built for consultations with clients and others, and these rooms were meant more for them, as opposed to the typical adventurer. In the event of a particularly large-scale, complicated, or sensitive request, these rooms provided clients with a much-needed sense of privacy. Basically, unless the client was of significant social status or economic power, they usually wouldn't be granted the use of such rooms. That wasn't all these rooms were used for, though. As far as my current situation with Sheila illustrated, it was plain to see these rooms were often used for private or secretive conversations as well. Why did Sheila drag me to such a place? Now adequately isolated, Sheila began speaking in a hushed whisper. In her hands was clutched a sheaf of papers, presumably requests from a client. Rent, due? Were you an associate of the Latchell family? Her secretive manner and strange question caused me to tilt my head sideways. The name in question was unknown to me, and I didn't recall ever hearing it anywhere before. I decided to answer Sheila truthfully.
No.
Why do you ask? Is it because of that request? Sheila nodded fervently, holding up the papers as she did so. Well, you see, this here specifically requests that you take on this task. Sheila handed over the documents slowly. Receiving them, I read through their contents quickly. The task requested by the client was shown simply: to harvest dragon blood blossoms from the swamp of Tarask at weekly intervals, and to deliver the flowers to a certain location. The reward for this task was an astronomical sum, numbers I couldn't have even imagined during my career of hunting goblins and slimes. The client's name was also printed clearly on the document. I was wondering what the fuss was. I see Isaac has issued his request. The client was none other than the man I had met in the swamp, Isaac Hart. Sheila seemed taken aback at my reaction. So you knew them after all? To be more accurate, Sheila seemed more stunned than surprised. I suppose this had something to do with that Latchell family she had mentioned prior. It would be logical to assume the client was Isaac's master.
I could see where this was going.
I suppose this Latchell family is the family Isaac serves. Yes. Sheila nodded, affirming my theory. The Latchell family is one of Malt's old families, deeply intertwined with the town's economic development. While I don't know much about the family barring its general history, it would seem they and the guild do have quite a bit of a shared history. One of the few organizations the guild would bend over backwards to appease, if I had to put it that way. Judging from Sheila's description, I suppose the family in question had some sensitive information regarding the guild in its hands. In any case, it was plain to see this Latchell family wielded considerable power in Malt. But Isaac didn't come across as an unpleasant or intimidating person. Curious, I questioned Sheila. Are they one of those powerful families who throw their weight around and make unreasonable demands?
No.
They are nothing like that. In fact, they have not been very active at all recently, and their activities hardly affect Malt's overall economy. Of course, their influence remains strong in Malt, at least. So, they have to be shown the appropriate amount of respect. A vague explanation. To start, are the Latchells nobles? Being a kingdom, Yaran had its princes and nobles. Specifically, the princes and marquises wielded the most power, followed by the peerages across the land. While some knights and squires were considered nobility as far as titles went, they didn't have as much influence, although some were quite fond of throwing their titles around. To the common folk, nobles were nobles, no matter how weighty their titles. Yaran was a relatively small kingdom on the fringes of civilization. No one would bat an eye at a duke engaging in agricultural work or an earl having his own storefront. Compared to most other kingdoms, the concept of nobility was somewhat more relaxed here, but I suppose that was a discussion for another time. Sheila soon provided an answer to my question. No, they are not nobles, Rent. They are simply an old, established family wielding considerable social clout due to the fact that they have been in Malt for quite a long time. At least, that is what I hear, hence the need to show them a degree of respect. Of course, there were also rumors that Viscount Lotnell, who rules over Malt and its surrounding areas, has deep connections with the Lachel family. Honestly speaking, the family is secretive, and even I and most of the guild staff do not know very much about them. Even so, every guild master I have seen in these halls shares the same view, that the guild should treat the Lachels with utmost respect. I am here discussing this with you for the very same reason as a reminder, Rent. Take care you don't do anything to upset them. Speak simply, Sheila. What do you mean? As I said, Rent, a staff member of my rank cannot possibly give you the specifics. However, you would do well to treat them with respect. The Lachel family is an old one with economic clout in Malt, as well as ties to noble families in the land. This much you understand, yes? In other words, Rent, if you were to refuse this request, you would no longer be able to live in Malt. Sheila said, somewhat exasperated. What a terrible development. I thought that I had simply run into an interesting individual in the bowels of the swamp of Tarask, but I hadn't the slightest clue about his identity. But of course, I had no intentions of turning down this request. All factors considered, the monetary rewards were great, and the official client was Isaac, not his master. In fact, I had only agreed to look at the request, and I would in turn only accept it if the terms were acceptable to me. The guild wouldn't want me to cancel under any circumstance, and that much I understood. Even so, it was good etiquette to at least meet with the client once and discuss the matter at hand before giving my answer. If I really had to turn it down, then that would be that. This was a request just like any other. I didn't see any problems of note. I was still very much interested in the specifics of the Lachel family, if only to better understand this powerful family that Isaac served. A personal curiosity, I suppose, not that Sheila could give me details, anyway. I supposed I could just ask them in person, or ask some of my informants and adventurer comrades. However, I had been adventuring in Malt for 10 whole years. Although I didn't have much in the way of combat skills, I considered myself well-informed when it came to Malt. Even so, I had never heard of the Lachel family before this day. The names of a few other powerful old families were known to me, but Lachel wasn't among them. How is this possible? In any case, Isaac would be able to tell me should he choose to do so, that is. Shelving my thoughts momentarily, I turned to Sheila. I have no intentions of turning down this request. I have spoken with Isaac in the depths of the swamp of Tarask. The reason why
He wanted to task me with this
request was because he could
see that.
I managed to venture deep into the swamp without much effort. So I will be accepting this request. Really? Will you be all right? I mean, your constitution, Rent. Sheila didn't finish her sentence, but I understood what she meant. I was still a monster, and the Lachel family was an old one with connections to the ruling nobles of the town. If I was somehow found out, I would surely be chased out of Malt. In the worst-case scenario, even Malt's denizens could turn on me, with the scenario eventually ending in my untimely death at the hands of my fellow adventurers. Not a good thought. I shook my head. I doubt they would easily find out, given my appearance.
In fact,
Isaac himself did not seem too bothered by how I looked when he met me. While I couldn't be sure of this, it was true Isaac didn't comment much on my appearance, so I suppose that was a fair assumption. Even if I was instructed to take off my robe and mask before the master of the Lachel family as a sign of respect, I could simply say I had been terribly burnt by acid and was a hideous spelter of a man. Surely they would accept such an explanation? If they didn't believe me, I would merely turn the request down then and there. Isaac was a man of his word. At least, that was the impression he gave me. Of all things, it seemed highly unlikely he would fixate on my appearance. Sheila nodded hesitantly. If anything happens, tell me, okay? I do not know what I can do, but I will help you with everything I've got. Nodding at Sheila's words, I patted her lightly on the shoulder with a gloved hand before exiting the room altogether. I am completely lost. This was the singular thought that filled my mind as I continued my journey to the Latchell family's grounds. I had intended to meet Isaac and discuss the details of the request. I was given appropriate instruction by the guild, of course. The location of the manor was clearly noted down on a map, and for all intents and purposes, was easy to understand. The manor sat in the outskirts of Malt, and I had arrived at the specified location without getting lost. The problem, however, was in the geography of the area. The Latchell family was adequately housed in a gigantic manor, and while that was my destination, I had to first pass through a large garden on its grounds before actually reaching the manor's doors. Not that rare of a sight, especially when it came to the fancy manners of powerful old families around these parts. The problem was hardly the manor, it was the garden in front of it. If I had to guess, this garden was probably born from the whims of a great Latchell in the past. Instead of a typically straight path to the manor, this garden was more like a twisting maze. One only had to set foot in its depths to find the tall hedges blocking one's view. These hedges were crafted from a rose-like shrub of sorts, with the plants growing to impossibly tall heights. All I could see around me was a sea of green. Advancing deeper down this path, I turned this way and that, and then the road before me forked. Beyond the fork was yet another fork, and this maze-like series of hedges continued indefinitely. Before long, I realized I was, for the lack of a better word, lost. Frankly speaking, I had no issues keeping my bearings, at least for the first few twists and turns. This was no longer the case as I went deeper into the garden maze, however. I could only stop in this maze of hedges, thinking back to the details of my request. If memory served, I had asked all the questions I needed to ask. Reminiscing, I calmed myself, recalling the initial conversation I had with the guard at the gates, prior to setting foot into this unreasonably hedgy maze. While I remembered the details of the request well, I didn't recall the request instructing me to go maze exploring. Yes, I had shown my documents to the gate guard, who didn't have many qualms about me entering. His gaze almost seemed transfixed on a faraway horizon I couldn't see, and he seemed happy to be rid of me. I did ask him some questions before I left, though. Are there any other entrances? The gate guard momentarily turned to look at the rose maze, before turning back to me slowly, shaking his head. Not that I know of, sir. Perhaps these other entrances do exist, but I do not know of them. His expression was serious and sincere, and it seemed like he had given my question considerable thought before answering. I could feel a wave of despair washing over me. I had no choice but to pass through this strange maze garden if I was to even knock on the manor's doors. How long does it usually take to the manor, sir? Well, that largely depends on the individual. The maze changes its paths occasionally, you see. As such, giving an accurate estimate of time would be quite beyond me. The guard said, an apologetic expression on his face. A maze that changed its paths occasionally? One would be hard-pressed to call it any ordinary maze. The guard, as if sensing my doubt, continued. But of course, sir. The maze itself is a special sort of magical tool, you see. The generational heads of the Latchell family have all shared an interest in collecting magical tools, and this maze is a phenomenon created by one of those tools. I could hardly conceal my surprise. Could such a magical tool even exist? I suppose it was possible. Magical tools could be widely split into 3 categories: divine tools, curiosities, and cursed artifacts. A tool from one of these categories could most likely give birth to such a maze. While most magical tools had certain standardized functions, there were outliers that were completely different from their brethren. A good example would be that of a light tool, which was a simple magical tool that lit up dark places. It had a high usage frequency and benefited from its simple construction. Since these tools could be made in large quantities, they were suitably cheap when sold on the market. Special tools, on the other hand, were quite different and were often one of a kind. An example would be my cursed mask and my waterproof robe. Such tools often had special or strange effects, and their value was highly subjective. Some of these special magical tools even had very useful effects, while others were questionable if they did anything at all. Due to the high varied nature of these tools, their value was often in flux as well. Take my mask, for instance, a highly useful tool given my unique constitution and situation, but one that was picked up by Rena for 3 bronze coins. I suppose the merchant selling it felt it was nothing more than a piece of junk and had set a suitably low price for it. It was, as it turned out, a cursed mask I have since been unable to remove, so the merchant's senses weren't too far off the mark. Given that my face looked the way it did, I could no longer tell if the curse of the mask was more of a blessing. Having unique hobbies is fine, I suppose. But to think I would have to overcome this hobby of theirs to even get there, I said, suitably irritated by the situation. The guard simply smiled in response. I do empathize, sir. But why not take a shot at it? The maze is designed to even out into a straight path to the entrance after someone has spent a certain amount of time in it. As a matter of fact, I have heard that those who successfully make it out of the maze before then are occasionally presented with a magical tool as a gift of appreciation. It would seem like the guard was trying to indirectly tell me something. As if noticing this, the guard continued, his expression unchanging. I, too, have challenged the maze quite some moons ago, sir. If there are no expected guests, this gate usually remains closed, but back then it was open. I had seen a poster, you see, claiming that challengers who managed to conquer the maze would be presented with a magical tool as a gift. On it was a map to the manor, and that was how I found myself before these very gates, all that time ago. It would seem like the Latuels were capricious individuals, seemingly enjoying their games. Given that they were an old family with financial clout, I suppose it wouldn't be too strange if they had simply decided to organize such events on a whim. Normally, most nobles settled for parties or other fancies, but those bored of otherwise plain social functions often explored more unconventional options. This was perhaps one such case. Of course, the guard continued, many other individuals saw the posters as well. I was not the only one to arrive at these gates. Many others stood here at this very spot, all with the same goal. Although many entered, many ended up lost, and after a while found themselves back here. All of them had lost their way somewhere in the maze, and after a short while, found that the maze itself shifted, leading them onto a path that led back to the entrance. I was surprised when I had first heard of this, but I supposed such a feat was possible with magical tools of some sort. Even though I thought it a largely impossible affair, the fact that the maze guided lost challengers back to the entrance was reassuring, so I set foot into it once again. And you reached the goal.
Yes.
It was a stroke of luck, if anything. I would not be able to do it again. Of that I knew very well. As promised, however, the then head of the Latuel family saw it fit to present quite a few magical tools to me, allowing me to choose between them. They were all respectably useful artifacts. Yes, but, well, I was out of a job then, sir. As embarrassing as it is for me to recount, I refused to take any tool as a reward and instead asked for a position at the manor. And so, they hired you. I see. Given the sheer size of the manor and the amount of land the family owned, I suppose it made sense that they had quite the collection of powerful magical tools. All things considered, the position of gate guard was probably a comparatively relaxed one. To his credit, the guard was quite serious at his job and was likely to keep it from here on out. On another
note,
I apologize if this is insensitive, but why were you out
of a job?
That, sir. I had gone against my superior's orders, you see. And to think I was this close to a stable, lifetime employment.
For shame.
But as a result, I did get offered a position here, and I have ever since decided to live with both my feet on the ground, or so they say. It is good to live honestly. A good thing, indeed. Even one such as myself could regain their humanity. Well, if I tried hard, perhaps. In any case, my decision to continue living responsibly hadn't changed in the slightest. And yet, Evolving into a stronger being after I was eaten wholesale by a mythical dragon wasn't half bad. I suppose life just had so many twists and turns. I looked at the guard, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie. I have learned a lot from our little
Talk.
I suppose I should try my hand at the maze as well. Any advice for a newcomer like me? It was a question new adventurers often ask their seniors. As if understanding my joke, the guard smiled, somewhat deeply. Yes, yes. Perhaps it would be wise not to depend on the sun for navigation, sir. I tilted my head at his words, but even so, the guard was a veteran of the maze. I put some trust into them. Thanking the guard, I turned toward the maze's entrance, taking one bold step into its confines. This really is something else. I held my head in despair as I continued inspecting my surroundings. I couldn't help it no matter where I looked, I was surrounded by hedges. I could no longer see the path that led me here, nor could I see a path that would lead me out of this maze. What exactly was a magical tool like this even developed for? While such a thought did cross my mind, it would be uncouth to say out loud. I suppose strange tools like this did exist. The tool itself could have been removed from its original abode, where it once had some special purpose. Magical craftsmen, though seen as inventors and facilitators of convenience in our modern age, were once seen as con men and cheats. Magical tools were born from man's desire to replicate what he had found or seen in the labyrinths. With that thought in mind, one could assume the original tool in question was truly a mysterious object with a variety of uses, if going by the official account history hard to share. Few magical tools were truly useless, however. One usually wouldn't find, say, a tool that only glowed dimly, or one that laughed in a high-pitched voice endlessly if tapped with a finger. Even if one did come across a seemingly pointless tool, it could be studied, dissected, and even have rare materials harvested from it. These materials would sell for a fair sum of coin. Such were the myriad of uses of said tools. Even I could see the tool that generated this rose hedge maze probably had some unique purpose of its own in the past. Even so, this garden was truly large. To maintain a maze of this scale, and an occasionally self-changing maze at that, required a significant amount of magical power. I suppose the Latuals didn't find that much of an issue, given their tendency to spend coin as if it were water. One could easily purchase many magical crystals with such finances, thus my worries about the maze suddenly giving out would be very much misplaced. Perhaps the original creator of the device wanted to know how it felt like to be completely lost, and created this tool as a means to escape the confines of reality? Thoughts and assumptions aside, all this speculation did little to change my current situation. I am truly lost. Is there really nothing I can do? My thoughts were interrupted by the scenery before me seemingly opening into another place. What is this place? I found myself surrounded by hedges once more, on a path that didn't seem too different from the ones I had followed thus far. The space before me, however, was bright, and rose blossoms bloomed on the once barren hedges. Up until now, all the hedges I had passed were a dull shade of green. While there were occasionally some blooming roses, they were of various colors and uneven distribution, seemingly more of a natural phenomenon than a man-made one. But this was different. Quite a few roses bloomed in this space. The roses were real, having reached out and touched some to confirm it for myself. The middle of this rose-filled chamber was different, too, or perhaps it better matched its surroundings. A table made from an opulent shell-like substance sat in the chamber, and an expensive tea set made of white porcelain sat atop it. Seated at the table on an equally iridescent shell chair was a figure, holding up a teacup in an impossibly elegant fashion. Raising the cup to their lips, they drank deep from it, their every action exuding refinement. Noticing my presence, the figure in question raised their head, staring straight in my direction. "Are you giving up?" "I see. This must be a member of the Lachel household, offering me a means of exit upon seeing I was lost." The figure in question was a young girl, maybe of 12 or 13 years of age. It almost seemed like she was a being not of this world. With a faraway gaze and a frilly black dress that didn't seem very functional, she sat, still looking my way. Her pure white skin struck quite the contrast to her blue eyes. Really, she looked somewhat unhealthy. An aura of frailty and decadence surrounded her, a result of noble breeding, perhaps? No, I answered her query without hesitation. I was thinking of trying a little harder. May I have a bit more time? No. The young girl smiled in response. Compared to her expressionless demeanor earlier, her smile lit up her features, making her look more her age. While this was nothing more than a personal observation, I felt this expression suited her better, but, as usual, that was a thought for another time. In that case, do head down that way. The maze goes on for quite a while more. On another note, if you would like to catch your breath, how about having some tea with me? I have prepared several teas, perhaps one of them would suit your tastes. While I hesitated to accept this sudden show of kindness, I eventually found myself wandering over, pulling out a chair for myself. I humbly accept. Very well. Allow me. I had reached out to the teapot, intending to fill my own cup, but the girl across the table had somehow reached it first, and she was now filling my cup with freshly brewed tea. The pot seemed to already be filled with hot water. I suppose the pot was a magical tool in and of itself, having other abilities in addition to its self-brewing capability. While I didn't feel anything too peculiar from the teacup, this little interaction alone was enough to illustrate that the Latuels loved collecting magical tools of all kinds. There was a constant demand for magical tools that could brew tea on their own, but such tools were rare, even in the deepest depths of the most treacherous labyrinths. Should one appear in an auction, it would be immediately snapped up by eager buyers, and for prices that defied common understanding. Craftsmen who were capable of creating such tools often sold their creations as soon as they came out of the kiln. To make things worse, the creation of these tools was by no means simple, and few craftsmen could create magical teaware of acceptable quality. Now, there were many collectors in the market. It was a highly competitive genre in magical tool collecting, if I could say so. This wasn't purely a pursuit amongst nobles, for even common folk who loved tea had a stake in it. If one had the funds, one would be able to purchase at least one tea set. That was how the common wisdom went. Magical teaware was quite highly ranked, even in the genre of competitive magical tool collecting. The rarer and more complicated its abilities, the higher the cost. Past a certain point, one required a fair amount of coin to continue collecting. Please have some tea. As you may have noticed, this pot is a magical tool. Once it is filled with tea leaves, one only has to infuse magic into the pot after a brew to replace the leaves with a new batch. I could only imagine the bidding process for such an amazing piece of magical teaware. I've been to several auctions in life as a mere spectator, but the few teapots I had seen could only keep their contents warm eternally, or possibly prevent the leaves within from ever entering one's drink. I also recalled a particularly sturdy, break-resistant pot. Compared to this, how much did the Latuels purchase this teapot for? My hand, still holding a cup full of tea, began shaking as I imagined how much all this had cost the Latuels. Although the cup itself wasn't enchanted or magical, it had a similar look and feel to the teapot in question. Its surface was illustrated with a beautiful mosaic of roses and vines, as if it were specifically prepared to match its surroundings. I suppose the Latuels had commissioned a craftsman to create cups that matched the pot. I, myself, knew the basics of creating ceramics, but only true artisans could create such intricate, even illustrations on such a small object. Judging by its appearance, this teacup alone would fetch a handsome price, even if it wasn't magical by any means. In such a case, it would be sold as an art piece. I couldn't even begin thinking about the consequences should I somehow shatter this cup. The young girl just laughed in response, as if reading my mind. Was it the look of apprehension I had? Even if you do break it, it's quite all right. Of course, I would greatly prefer if you didn't stand up and hurl it onto the ground with all your might. But I assure you, I wouldn't be angered in the event of an accident. Please relax and slowly enjoy the brew. Neither the girl's voice nor gaze betrayed any untoward intent. Was this what it meant to never pick fights with the rich? How very terrible, And that was a sincere thought that had risen up from the very depths of my poverty-filled heart. As she lifted the cup to her lips yet again, I couldn't help but notice that the young girl across the table was staring at me, her blue eyes transfixing on my masked face. "What is it?" I asked. I beg your pardon. I was simply wondering how you would drink the brew, given how you are dressed." That. It probably goes without saying that my mask couldn't be taken off, and doing so during mealtimes wasn't something I had even considered. I still had my mask on at this point in time, hence the curious stare from the girl across the table. Yes, taking it off would make it easier for me to eat and drink. The technical aspects of it aside, there was a good reason why I could not. I was an undead, a thrall. While I couldn't speak for other thralls, I assumed I couldn't just take my mask off and show my face in public. With that being said, however, my mask did arrange itself to show the lower half of my face during certain instances, like when I dined with Lorraine. The situation was somewhat different for Lorraine, and adults in general, since they would be able to tolerate the sight of my wrinkled skin, assuming I had been the victim of burns or other injuries. But the girl across the table from me was a young child about 12 to 13 years of age. The lower half of my face would be far too grotesque a sight for a young girl of that age. If I had to point out the most rotted, disgusting part of my thrall body at this point in time, it would be the lower half of my face. I had no lips, and my gums and teeth were visible, like white monuments protruding from wrinkled skin. At a glance, someone would merely assume the lower half of my face was skeletal in nature.
No.
Perhaps it was even more fearsome than just some dried old bones. Due to the half-heartedly human state my body was in, certain muscles were visible, attached to the jawbone and other parts of my chin. Their movements, too, could be clearly seen. Surely this would have a more disturbing impact than regular, clean, white bones. All in all, showing my face to the girl would be a bad idea. In which case, exactly what sort of excuse should I weave? Is that a magical tool of some sort? A question from the girl herself, in response to something she had seen, probably. If I had to guess, my mask had changed its shape once more. But instead of revealing the entire bottom half of my face, the mask had seen fit to open up a small slit where my mouth was just the right shape for me to drink tea from. Under normal circumstances, this shape couldn't be maintained for more than a few seconds, as it would return to its previous shape after. In my experience, though, this was more than enough time for me to drink tea. Raising the cup to the opening in my mask, I drank, responding to the girl in between sips. Not so much a magical tool, more of a cursed artifact. An acquaintance of mine bought it from a Maltesian roadside merchant. At my word, the girl's eyes opened wide, almost sparkling as she responded excitedly. Malt plays host to such interesting objects? Do excuse my impertinence, but is there any way I could take that mask off your hands? The Latchell family supposedly had a habit of collecting magical tools of all kinds. From the girl's behavior, it would seem there was indeed some truth to that rumor. Although I didn't know the girl's exact social standing in the Latchell family, I could be sure of one thing. Unlike Isaac, who served the family, this girl was unmistakably one of the few who were served by individuals like him. I suppose she meant to pay me to take it off my hands, and, as expected, the conversation veered in that direction. But of course, the girl continued, I will ensure you are adequately compensated and satisfied with the exchange. So, how about it? Her voice was eager. Honestly speaking, I would have loved to hand my mask over to her. Unfortunately, it wasn't something I could do at this point in time. Cursed object though it may be, the mask had also become an indispensable tool in my daily life. In addition, the mask was also cursed to be adequately immovable, and that was what I would tell her. At the very least, I would need a face I could show to other human beings before considering its removal. For all intents and purposes, it still remained resolutely stuck to my face despite my personal preferences, and that was that. Even if I earnestly attempted to remove it, it would surely be an impossible feat. A vision of myself drowning in a small mountain of gold coins passed rapidly before my eyes. The temptation seemed to slowly draw me away from reality, but I resolutely shook my head, suppressing my worldly desires. My apologies. It is not about the money. I am simply Unable. I suppose it was quite a pathetic, or at least sorrowful tone of voice, as the girl's previously excited expression was now one of pity.
No.
That is fine. It would appear I have dredged forth some unpleasant memories and have crudely offered you coin in exchange.
Ido e pależais.
Unpleasant memories? No, nothing of the sort. No special thoughts or memories of any kind resided in this mask. Really, it was much more like a nightmare, one that had suddenly stuck itself to my face and never let go. Even now, despite my best efforts, my mask remained very much attached. If I had to put it into words, the despair I was feeling now wasn't the sadness of losing an old friend or a valuable tool for money, but instead the prospect of losing out on a potential mountain of earnings because I couldn't take this accursed mask off. Judging by the girl's reaction, I suppose it was smarter for me to hold my peace, for fear of earning her disdain. Though money was certainly important.
No.
I do not
Mind.
One cannot possibly
Tell.
such things just by looking at an object. If anything,
I'm grateful.
that you showed me such consideration. As I said, from the outside, no one could possibly discern my intense material attachment to coin, which was fine, for I looked more respectable this way. Alas, what a terrible adult I have become. Looking at the girl's pure, innocent eyes. I would be most grateful if you do indeed feel that way, yes. On another note, is the tea to your liking? An unexpected and skillful change of subject. At her prompting, I turned my attention to the teacup in my hands. For some reason, it tasted delicious. Incredibly delicious. The fragrance, as well, was in a class of its own. This may very well be the best cup of tea I had tasted my entire life. This is the most delicious tea I have had in my life. I responded to the girl's question honestly. Is this also thanks to the magical aspects of the teapot? I would suppose so, yes. However, it is less the teapot's magic and more of the skill and hard work the farming families have put into raising the plants used. As I have mentioned before, this pot has the magical ability to infinitely recreate any tea leaves that have been placed into it. In other words, someone had put these leaves in years, perhaps even decades ago. Among all the different blends I have tasted from the archives within this pot, I find this one to be the most delicious, so to speak. As she said, the tea was quite good. Many factors influence the quality of tea leaves, including terrain and weather, to name a few. Due to this, tea leaves often varied greatly in terms of quality. One wouldn't also realistically expect to enjoy similar tasting tea all year round. This pot was the exception, allowing its wielder to enjoy a variety of blends from various parts of the lands at any time of the year. Illogical, yet terribly impressive, this teapot must have surely cost quite a fortune. I had originally assumed the pot could only recreate the most recent leaves that had been brewed in it, but it would seem like I was mistaken. To recreate any and all blends that have ever been brewed in its porcelain body, this teapot was on another level altogether. It was possibly the ultimate teapot. Though some individuals preferred to enjoy a steady stream of changing flavors as the years passed, and to reminisce of previous blends in their memories. It was quite reasonable to assume, however, that most people would readily see the value in such a pot and desire it. Where, exactly, did you manage to procure such an item? If I do recall, it was discovered in a faraway labyrinth almost 2 centuries ago. A sum of coin was offered to the adventurer who had found it, and it made its way into our possession. As for the sum, I do believe it was, say, about 300 platinum coins. Platinum
Coins.
As long as one wasn't reckless with their money, a single platinum coin was more than enough for a person to live a merry life. To think 300 of these coins were paid. It was far from a reasonable price for a single pot. To a family like the Latchuels, however, it probably wasn't that great of a sum at all. After all, they had paid such a colossal sum to this unnamed adventurer, yet still managed to live in such finery for the next 2 centuries. Plus, they continued maintaining their sphere of influence in Malt. I finally understood that the Latchuels were a far more dangerous family than the few small-time nobles currently ruling over Malt. After some subsequent topics of conversation, I eventually stood up, taking care not to drop or knock anything over. "Oh, are you already going?" the girl asked. "Yes, I am indeed.
It was
Most enjoyable. This is just a guess, but I feel like we will soon meet again, no?" "Oh." The girl smiled vaguely in response to my question. "Have you already found out?" With that, it was clear she was indeed a member of the Latchell family. As to her social position within it, I still didn't have enough information on my hands.
yes.
In some way or another, I shall ask for your
Name.
when we meet again. Well then, do be careful. The end of the maze is not far now, but perhaps I shall grant unto you a hint. It would be best for you to not look at the sun. I have actually already heard that from the guard at the gate. Oh,
Perhaps it was unnecessary, then.
do give those words some thought, however. I understand. With that, I took a step out of the clearing and almost immediately, a wall of vines and leaves sprouted from where I stood moments ago, sealing off the girl and her tea table from my view. Taking a good look at my surroundings, I realized all the paths before me continued on deep into the maze. No matter how I looked at it, I would surely be lost regardless of whichever path I took. Not long until the
End, she said.
"Is that really true?" I muttered under my breath as I began venturing through the maze once more. I just wanted to reach the end of the maze as quickly as possible.
Come to think of it,
Yes, come to think of it, the very fact I was lost was strange, if only because I was an adventurer who had been in the business for years. I personally felt I had a better sense of direction than most, and I'd been mentally mapping this garden maze of the Latchells as I traversed its snaking paths. Despite this, I had become lost. How was this possible? I couldn't understand it. The problem at hand defied understanding. Then there was the issue of the sun, and the advice both the girl and guard had given me. When I first heard it from the guard, I had simply assumed one couldn't use the sun to accurately determine one's geographical position and bearings. So I had followed their advice and ended up becoming very lost. Perhaps a change of pace was due, so I turned upward, looking at the sun. It seems like how it has always been. There was nothing particularly odd about the position of the sun in the sky, or so I thought. That must be the case, then. Did their advice have nothing to do with the sun at all? I turned a corner. The sun's position shifted before my very eyes. Adequately surprised and assuming it was just a figment of my imagination, I took a single step back into the previous walkway. As I did, the sun's position shifted once more. I suppose the advice of not using the sun as a directional marker was indeed true. In which case, how is it possible I was still so lost?
No.
No, there must be something more to all this. The strangely flipping sun was probably only one part of a larger mechanic. One couldn't depend on the sun to find one's way. That much I understood. There had to be a bigger mechanism at work here, one I wasn't yet aware of. If the guard had indeed been misled by the sun during his attempt at the maze, that was all fair and good, hence his advice to me. But my case was slightly different. If the advice was meant to mislead, I would have to start questioning the girl's intentions. Should that truly be her intent, she would be quite the character. She had given me the same advice even after understanding her guard had done the same, going so far as to tell me to give her words some thought. There had to be some other means of deception at play. Essentially, the guard's advice was the truth, but the girl's advice was meant to trick and mislead me. I could assume so anyway. She had quite a mysterious aura about her, and I just couldn't get a good read on her character at all. I suppose it was fair to assume she wasn't an individual who would so readily give me a hint on how to conquer the maze, would she? I continued exploring, but it didn't take long for me to feel that something was off. After walking in a straight line for some distance, I felt like the path had mysteriously curved to one side. Although it was a small, almost insignificant sensation, I certainly felt it, so this was no trick of the mind. I glanced around, affirming my surroundings. Little had changed, but a cursory look at the sun revealed it had sunk a little lower than when I had last looked at it. The sun's position had changed, but this knowledge was of little use to me. What should I do? I stopped in my tracks, thinking about the problem at hand. It was at this moment I saw, from the corner of my eye, a rock at my feet. It was a considerably sized rock the size of a fist, perhaps. Picking it up, I hurled the rock at the strange, seemingly twisted space before me. The rock then promptly disappeared in the middle of its arc, without a single trace or sound. Impossible. Is this teleportation? Teleportation, to be precise. It was a special type of spatial magic yet to be recreated by the hands of man. However, if this was truly an artifact that hadn't been crafted by men, then there was a possibility. Only a magical tool with a significant amount of magical power could cause a rose maze like this one to appear. I wouldn't be surprised if teleporting objects and people was one of its functions. But could an individual even own, much less contain, such a powerful artifact? I suppose such a line of questioning didn't help matters. For now, I had to focus on the actions I could potentially take. If I didn't do as such, I would never conquer this maze, and I would surely be lost forever. I picked up yet another rock, tossing it into the strange space before me. It didn't seem like much had changed at all, but this little experiment was more than enough to illustrate that a change had taken place, for the rock was nowhere to be seen. There was only one explanation. The rock in question had landed in that invisible space. I threw yet another rock into the strange spot, and, again, it vanished. As I thought, the rocks had passed through this invisible point in space and landed somewhere on the other side. Upon closer observation, this part of the labyrinth was very much like any other part of it. If I hadn't been paying attention, I wouldn't have given that dissonant feeling much thought. I suppose this was why I had been stuck in this maze. The map in my mind was drawn under the assumption all the paths were physically connected. In reality, this maze was made of many passages connected by pockets of spatial distortions. If my assumptions were correct, then I no longer knew where I had stepped or even set foot in. It didn't seem like I would reach the goal anytime soon. However, from this point on, it would be different. I would mark this location as the starting point and redraw my mental map. Honestly speaking, I had thought of using the map of Akasha in this silly maze, but the map only displayed a single line as I unfurled it. Unable to display current location. Although I had asked the map aloud what it meant, it offered back no response. And that was that. I suppose this maze was clearly nothing more than a plaything for the rich. There were even prizes in it for me if I won, and I wouldn't die should I fail in my task. But having come this far, I was determined to press on, and maybe even tell that girl with the terrible personality I hadn't fallen victim to her tricks. Even though I had already fallen for it multiple times, and ended up becoming very, very lost. I finally made it. Leaving the maze of rose hedges behind, I stepped out into an open space. Before me was an elegant, yet beautiful manor, complete with an elaborate water fountain. Next to that fountain, on yet another ornate table, sat the girl in question, elegantly sipping away at a teacup. Next to her, as expected, was none other than Isaac. Upon noticing me, the girl got up, advancing in my direction. Isaac followed silently after the girl, who, before long, was standing before me. Congratulations. To be completely honest, I didn't think you were capable of conquering the maze. Although her expression was that of a 12 or 13-year-old girl, I knew of the darker personality behind it. There was nothing I could do, of course. To be honest, the girl may be mischievous, but she was by no means malicious. I suppose this was a prank as good as any, given that at no point in time was my life in danger. However, the fact that I had spent all this time wandering about just because of a little girl's whim was truly upsetting. When I arrived at the Latchel Manor, the sun was high in the sky. That very same sun was now setting, tinting the world with a fading shade of crimson. Just how long did I spend in that maze? I had thought I would have conquered the maze much faster, at least, until I understood the meaning of your words. I see, so you did notice. Perhaps my acting was not quite up to par.
No.
It was fine. In fact, if it were my old self, I would have certainly fallen for it. I couldn't exactly tell her I had become a thrall. The only reason why I'd noticed that pocket of distorted space was due to my heightened senses, those being of spatial awareness, a better sense of smell, and more acute vision. Therefore, I couldn't exactly say my past life's experience caused me to notice the spatial fault, though I couldn't entirely discredit it, either. The girl shook her head slowly at my words. Your old self, you say? No. I shook my head in the same way in response. Just some circumstances of mine. On another note, I had heard from the guard that those who conquer the maze can claim a reward. Get one, too. On one hand, I had put in a fair amount of work to get to this point. On the other, the reward was a bit of an afterthought, merely information I had chanced upon when speaking with the guard at the gate. Even if the Latchuels decided there would be no reward in it for me on this occasion, I suppose I had some degree of justification to ask for one. Such thoughts didn't seem necessary, however, as the girl soon answered me, that same smile on her face. Oh, yes, of course. I had intended to gift upon you one magical tool the Latchuel family has owned. As I had expected, maybe now it was my turn to be mischievous. Well,
then,
how about the magical
tool
that was used to make this rose hedge maze? I asked bluntly. The girl's eyes immediately opened wide. I cannot possibly gift that magical tool to you. If you would be so kind as to understand. It was a joke. I immediately responded to her statement. Just like how you
played a trick on me
in the maze. I thought I would return the favor. The girl looked exasperated at my declaration. You are a bad man, she said, the ghost of a wry smile flitting across her face. I couldn't just spout out what manner of magical tool I would like. The Latchuel family, given its history of collecting such tools over the ages, would surely only take the cream of the crop. Regardless of my choice, the tool I would choose would surely sell for a great sum of coin. I'd probably take any tool I was offered, but if given a choice to select a specific object, in any case, perhaps I might look at your offerings? The girl seemed prepared for such a question. Oh, but of course. This way, if you would, she said, walking toward the manor's doors. Isaac, for his part, followed silently after her. Given his continued silence thus far, I had no doubt he was this mischievous girl servant. Isaac's master. Mistress, possibly? Oh, yes. I have all but forgotten to introduce myself. I am the current head of the Latchuel family, Laura Latchuel. Pleased to make your acquaintance. And so the mystery was solved. This girl wasn't a Latchuel family member's daughter or anything of the sort. She was the head of the family herself. Although her age surprised me to a certain extent, there were no age restrictions when it came to inheriting family titles, unlike that of adventure registration. There were quite a few instances where the family's fate was thrust into the hands of a capable young heir, be the circumstances extenuating or otherwise. In the case of noble families, it was common for a child not yet of age to inherit such a title, especially after particularly bloody family feuds. The Latchuel family, while not noble in origin, had significant financial power. I could believe there were ferocious battles for the title of family head. Money and power were quite terrifying things. I turned to Laura, introducing myself. I, too, did not introduce myself. My name is Rent Vivi, a bronze class adventurer. At those words, a brief expression of surprise crossed Laura's features. Isaac, on the other hand, remained predictably stoic. Like master, like servant, I suppose. In other words, they didn't exactly think less of me even after learning of my relatively low adventurer rank. Admirable as far as attitudes went, but a rare one if I had to say. I was the individual they were about to task with the job, and most people would feel reassured by the presence of a higher-ranked adventurer. Of course, there would be no problems if the request in question was suited to the skills of a bronze-class adventurer. In the case of nobility, merchant families, or immensely powerful families like the Latchuels, the guild would most likely dispatch a high-ranked adventurer to ensure their satisfaction. At the very least, A bronze-class adventurer wouldn't show up, and the requester would expect a silver-class individual. To summarize, I was only here because Isaac had asked for me by name. Under normal circumstances, individuals such as him or Laura would never entrust a low-ranked adventurer like myself with any requests. Laura didn't even seem too bothered after hearing about my rank. Did Isaac tell her about what he had seen at the swamp? That didn't quite look like it was the case. Laura shot a sideways glance at Isaac. Her expression seemed to convey understanding. If I had to guess, Isaac had probably given her a somewhat vague description of me, as opposed to going deep into the specifics. While I had assumed Isaac would simply explain any and everything to his mistress, I suppose this wasn't the case. What exactly was their relationship like? A cursory examination showed that Isaac generally obeyed Laura's every whim like that Poochie Surrey familiar of mine. On another note, Edel was conspicuously missing from his usual perch on my shoulder. He apparently had a meeting with his underlings in the orphanage's basement, and had wandered off to deal with some matters of his own. Personally, I didn't want to explain to the Latuels why there was a monster perched on my shoulder, so this was probably for the best. He was a clean mouse, having been purified by my divinity on a few occasions, but I didn't doubt that some individuals would only see him as a dirty beast. An individual's perception of things tended to change depending on their upbringing, so it probably wouldn't be strange for some nobles to recoil before a supposedly impure mouse. Almost immediately, I felt a mental kick from Edel, seemingly declaring he was, indeed, very much pure and clean. I thought back at him, informing my familiar this was more about appearances than reality. Seemingly satisfied, Edel went back to his affairs. Sometimes I couldn't help but feel Edel was a much more logical being than I ever could be. A bronze-class adventurer taking on the swamp of Tarask. Not a very pleasant place, no doubt, but also not one bronze-class adventurers would frequent, at least from what I have heard. May I ask what exactly it was you were doing there? Laura asked, apparently confused. Did she not hear of my circumstances from Isaac, then? But of course, Isaac didn't have any reason to inform his mistress of my personal motivations. There was a request, I answered plainly, from the orphanage, asking if I could pick just one dragon blood blossom for a single bronze coin. My brief description of the situation was probably more than enough for most adventurers to understand the circumstances. But Laura didn't seem to share this understanding. Tilting her head to one side, she continued on. A trip to the swamp of Tarask for one bronze piece? I find that somewhat. I suppose a more detailed explanation was in order. It was a request from one of the orphanages in Malt. That is just how it is. Most adventurers would expect nothing more than a bronze
Peace.
in return. As I may have mentioned before, orphanages weren't swimming in pools of coin. Unable to offer an adequate reward, a token sum of one bronze coin was offered instead. It made perfect sense. There was more to this reward, however, namely that the adventurer in question was content with taking volunteer work. Since the Adventurers Guild was, for all intents and purposes, a profit-driven organization, such requests would normally never be officially fulfilled. But as history has proven, kind-hearted adventurers did show up across the ages, and they occasionally offered their assistance at the guilds they frequented. These acts of goodwill silently continued on today, and was a system of sorts in its own right. Just as how there were problems that could only be solved by adventurers, or those with martial force in any given era, there would surely be individuals who couldn't pay for their services. The Adventurers Guild, in turn, would decide to help out ever so slightly with these affairs, and these well-intentioned adventurers began accepting a token payment of one bronze piece for the sake of adequate record-keeping. One bronze coin was the lowest possible monetary reward a client could offer for services rendered by the guild's adventurers, and it was a minimal reward that could at most only purchase 2 pieces of bread. But there was no rule in place stating that providing the absolute minimum was prohibited. As long as one bronze coin was provided to the guild, the request would be posted onto the boards, thus exposing it to adventurers. After the guild had first and foremost met the client, It was then up to the individual adventurer to decide if they would take on the request, considering the potential gains and understanding the described situation on the request sheet. Should the services of an adventurer be required, the request would be approved. This made it so that, while the overall reward of the request was low, well-intentioned adventurers could volunteer to take on the case, eventually solving it should everything work out. There were certainly some malicious or stingy parties who sought to abuse the system of goodwill, but the guild was well-versed in weeding out false requests. Such requests would be evaluated to see if the client was truly in dire need of help. Should this not have been the case, the request would simply be discarded. The system, by and large, functioned quite well. Having finally concluded my explanation, Laura's expression softened considerably, as if moved by the tale. I did not know such gentle-hearted adventurers existed in these lands. I could hardly fault her for the assumption, seeing as adventurers didn't exactly have the best of reputations. Even I was a suspicious, skull-masked man in black robes. Few would look at me and go, "Oh, there be a gentle and kind adventurer." This was hardly about gentleness or kindness. I merely did what I could. Adventurers, by nature of their career, often had close brushes with tragedy or death. Amidst all that, one would occasionally want the affirmation that they had done at least one good thing, so that was when such requests were accepted and voluntarily fulfilled, all for the price of one bronze piece. Perhaps I wasn't too different, with how I was clinging on to what remained of my humanity. With everything being said, this manor was really quite large. From its external appearance alone, I felt it was more of a castle as opposed to a manor of any kind, so maybe that much wasn't exactly strange. What was strange was how most of the mansion was relatively deserted. Although we passed by a servant or two, few people walked the halls of this grand manor. More accurately, the amount of people I passed by hardly seemed sufficient to maintain the general cleanliness of a mansion of this scale. Curious, I raised the question to Laura, only to be told that each and every one of her servants were highly skilled and capable. While Isaac certainly seemed capable of the more worldly senses, skill alone couldn't possibly maintain a mansion of this size. It would be physically impossible, I thought. Observing my surroundings, I found that none of the hallways, walls, or even the hanging chandeliers seemed to have a single speck of dust on them. I looked around some more, and was forced to come to the conclusion that the Latchel Manor hardly seemed understaffed. "This way, if you would." Laura placed her hand on a heavy, metallic door, giving it a good push. The door opened effortlessly, revealing a winding passageway of downward-leading stone steps. I felt like I was walking into the depths of the underworld itself. "Your basement, I suppose?"
Yes.
"There are quite a few magical tools stored here, you see, with some infused with mana, spirit, and the like. There are, however, quite a few older artifacts among them, and we do take care to store our tools appropriately. As such, the temperature and humidity of our basement is regulated to provide an optimal environment for storage." When it came to magical tools with somewhat complex inner mechanisms, most craftsmen simply had them infused with mana, hence reinforcing said tools. Most magical tools were made to be sturdy in the first place. Just like how adventurers strengthen their bodies with mana and spirit for greater strength and endurance, the same could be done to a magical tool. This meant magical tools typically outlasted their more mundane counterparts, often for significant periods of time. Due to their sturdier nature, certain magical tools that were treated as national treasures and handed down over the ages still looked somewhat new to the average observer. If one was careless or rough with a magical tool, however, it could very well break, much like any other mundane tool would. Putting one foot before the other, I continued down the spiraling stone steps, following closely after Laura. Isaac followed after me, with the passageway being too narrow for two people. There were no windows lining the walls, but I could faintly feel the air moving as we continued downward. Unseen lights methodically lit themselves as Laura continued on silently, flickering to life with the occasional puff. Magical tools as well, no doubt. Light-bearing tools were easy to make and could be mass-produced for a relatively low price, but the sheer amount of them present in this passageway surprised me. Since these lights lit up when in proximity of a person, I could fairly assume they cost more than the typical light tool did. Looking at the Latchell family's architectural choices alone, I wondered where exactly they had obtained such riches from. Perhaps that was a question I could bring up later. Our seemingly endless descent continued, only ending when Laura came to a stop before a single door. Upon closer inspection, there appeared to be a board of some sort stuck to the door, made of a material I didn't recognize. Laura held up her right hand, placing it onto the board without a word. Without warning, the entire door was enveloped by a bright glow before emitting a dull, clanking sound of something being unlocked. "Well, then, let us enter," Laura said, giving the handle of the door a push. It opened slowly, without much resistance. As I had thought, Laura's previous motions had unlocked some sort of unseen mechanism. Beyond this door was a gaping, pitch-black maw, of which I could hardly see anything within its depths. Laura didn't seem very afraid of this darkness at all, stepping through the door without a word. Hesitating momentarily, I quickly followed after Laura, plunging into the deep unknown. Laura continued walking straight ahead, not stopping or showing any signs of reservation at the darkness around us. Suddenly, she stopped once more. "Let there be light." At those words, I found myself blinded. We were surrounded, enveloped in an unreasonably bright light. My eyes took but a moment to adjust to my newly illuminated surroundings. This is amazing. I was surrounded by what appeared to be small hills of magical tools, somewhat haphazardly stacked on top of each other. Taking a closer look, I discovered they were, in fact, organized. Their differing sizes and overwhelming numbers suggested to the viewer that the tools were stored in a messy heap. Laura, as if reading my mind, offered a quick explanation. "Do keep in mind we have arranged our tools, yes. It was much messier before, due to the fact they had just been thrown in here in the order of their acquisition. Now, however, most of the tools have been sorted by usage, era of production, craftsman, or labyrinth of origin, all relevant variables. Given the sheer amount of them, and the presence of quite a few articles within as of yet unknown purpose, it would take some time to finish sorting them all." Laura had a point. So filled was the room with tools that sorting through them would be time-consuming. Sorting magical tools wasn't exactly like arranging one's attic or storeroom, after all. Among the tools was a particularly large object, at least 3 times as big as the average person. What did the tool do, and how did one move it, I wondered. Given Laura's stature, having her move it would be impossible. Maybe Isaac assisted her with its transport? The servants of the Latchell family seemed to have their work cut out for them. "You may choose one magical tool of your liking from within this room," Laura continued. "All of these tools are first-rate, at least I would like to say that, but I cannot really be sure. Hopefully you have an eye for magical tools, Rent."
What do you mean?
I asked Laura for an explanation. "Perhaps you may already know of this, Rent, but objects of true value are often mixed in with mere curiosities. In any case, magical tools that have caught my fancy are gathered in this room. It is difficult to say if the tools in question have any innate value, or if they are simply junk. While I do not mind if you choose something of your liking and take it with you, I can only assume an adventurer would want a somewhat useful magical tool, hence my initial warning." "I see." There were, in fact, some magical tools that merely specialized in floating or jumping in place. It would be a bad choice on my part if I had obtained a tool of no meaningful function even after my deliberate choice. However, for me to discern between the supposed values of magical tools was somewhat difficult. I could recognize the more common types of tools used in daily life, but many of the tools at my feet were foreign in appearance. If I had to guess, the greater half of these tools were purchased at auctions and were probably one of a kind, in which case, just looking at the tools wouldn't be of much help. Thinking about the matter for a while, I soon decided to ask Laura for some assistance. "If there is something that catches your attention, all you have to do is ask. I will explain what I know of its functions to you. Of course, in some cases, even I would not know what the tool does, therefore, you would have to be the one who makes the final choice." "I am grateful for your hospitality. I do wonder, however,
Why did
you gather tools like these?" Logically speaking, if one didn't know what a magical tool did, it would be little more than a piece of scrap. Laura promptly responded with laughter at my question. I simply like to gather things, of course. If I can have it, I'll take it. That's all there is to it, she responded, amused. I suppose I could understand Laura's motivations. In some ways, it was a sort of universal truth, especially among the nobility and the rich merchant families. With so much disposable wealth at their fingertips, many of these individuals naturally turned to collecting items. They could collect just about anything, locks and the magical crystals of goblins, and even goblins themselves. One hears of these eccentric individuals and their habits from time to time. Such collections were interesting in their own right, but the common observer would find it strange instead. As long as the collector in question enjoyed their venture, then all was well, so I suppose asking for a justification was simply part of the human condition. In cases like these, however, there were sometimes no real answers. The collector wanted to collect, and that was that. It was easy to understand the Latchell family's magical tool collection habit, and if I could somehow profit by selecting a rare tool, I wouldn't be one to complain. What is this? Walking around the room, a certain object caught my attention. It was disc-like, or perhaps it was more of a cylinder and lying on its side. Curious, I pointed at it, and Laura promptly nodded, offering a swift explanation. That would be more a model of some sort as opposed to a magical tool. A model of a craft that carries its master across the lands. An airship. It moves in much the same way as a real one would, too, if you just do this. Laura picked up a magic crystal which had been next to the little flying model in question before inserting it into the object. After infusing the assembled item with some mana, Laura seemed momentarily lost in thought, holding some unseen object in her hands. With that, the steam spouted forth from the little model, launching it into the air. In reality, Laura continued, airships that fly across these lands nowadays are powered not by mana, but by steam. Technically speaking, it is not really a model, but perhaps a toy of some sort that was meant to imitate the functions of an airship. Even I had heard of airships at some point in my adventuring career, not that I had ever ridden on one. As Laura had said, these airships flew across the lands, but they hardly had a reason to dock in a rural border kingdom like Yaran. I did hear of airships turning up during festivals in the capital on occasion, but that was the extent of it. In addition, the fares and freight charges for transporting goods on an airship were adequately high, so those on board were mainly individuals with significant financial power. As a bronze-class adventurer, it goes without saying that I had never encountered any clients of that social class, so I had a relative unfamiliarity with airships. Looking up at the little flying model airship darting this way, and that, however, I could feel that traveling on a real airship could be quite the experience. The object that Laura held in her hand seemed to be a decorative stone carving of sorts, and if I had to guess, that would be the device with which one controlled the little flying airship. Would you like to try moving it? Laura said, holding out the item. I nodded eagerly. It was quite a simple device. All one had to do was hold the carving and think of the direction and altitude one wished the little airship to travel at. It didn't take long for me to appreciate its addictive nature. Only mages who had mastered special kinds of magecraft were able to fly through the air like this little model airship did. Maybe it would be more accurate to say that humanity itself idolized flight in some capacity. While one could easily travel through the clouds on the deck of an airship, I hardly had the financial capability to do so. As such, having the ability to move this model airship through the skies was quite the delight. Enjoying yourself, I presume? Laura asked, her eyes following the airship as it darted this way and that. I promptly nodded. Yes. Almost makes me want to take it home. I see. Would you settle for this model airship then? No, perhaps not. While I wanted so much to take it home, bringing a toy with no other notable function back with me was somewhat, well, while the youth inside me would have gladly settled for such a thing, the adult vehemently disagreed, claiming I should choose a tool that would assist me in my daily life. But of course, the adult was right. Yes, perhaps you are right, inner adult. But is work and common sense all there is to life? Is that true fun? The youth defiantly asked. Well, yes, there was that too. In any case, I should really refrain, as much as it pained me to do so. Just as I had made up my mind, Laura interrupted me, apparently having more to say about the little airship. Since you are having such fun, why not try using its other functions? Try focusing your thoughts on the airship itself. I followed Laura's instructions obediently. Without warning, the scene before my eyes promptly disappeared, being replaced with quite the strange sight. I seemed to be looking downward from the airship itself. From this vantage point, I could see a robed, masked man and a beautiful young girl next to him.
What
Is this? My momentary panic broke my concentration, and before I knew it, my vision had returned to normal. Before me stood Laura, who continued her explanation of the airship's functions. That little airship does more than just fly. It is capable of temporarily hosting its controller's consciousness. Although I called it a model, that was not quite accurate. In truth, the airships across the land were made in the image of this little one here. This one is the original, so to speak. It was born from the depths of a labyrinth, after all. In other words, the grand airships that sailed across the great kingdoms and countries of the lands were nothing more than an imitation of this little toy-like craft floating in this room. With that said, most magical tools in the lands were made in a similar fashion, being inspired by labyrinth finds. Even so, contemporary airships were powered by steam, not magic, so I suppose completely copying the intricate mechanisms of this little device was beyond the current capabilities of man. Magical tools found in the depths of a labyrinth were notoriously difficult to understand, even after detailed analysis and dissection. Most of the time, though, it was within the means of mankind to create an object that was somewhat similar in function. But the ability to host one's consciousness was quite remarkable in itself. I focused my mind on the craft once more, and almost immediately, I was treated to a bird's-eye view of the room we were in. This was no longer just some toy. If anything, it was a terribly useful tool. With this, I would be able to observe faraway locations from the air. It would be an invaluable implement for scouting. Yes, this was no longer just some toy. Laura seemed to agree with my thoughts. Well, yes, I suppose it could be used in such a fashion. Do take note, though. Since it is powered by mana, it would be difficult for it to travel great distances. One would be wise to choose when to use it. For instance, when scouting the path ahead, or for a short survey of the area from the air. It is capable of that much. Laura had a point. While she had infused the magic crystal with a fair amount of mana just now, I could feel there wasn't much fuel left in the device. I suppose it could fly for about 5 minutes at best, as it seemed difficult for the little airship to stay in the air for any longer than that. If it couldn't travel long distances, its consciousness-shifting function wouldn't be all that useful after all. Maybe if one had deep reserves of mana, it would be usable in some capacity. Considering Laura had used quite a large crystal to begin with, I surmised that all my mana would only be able to power this tool for 10 minutes at most. I think it is a pretty good
tool.
Well, then, I suppose this one does not quite fit your tastes. Laura asked, somewhat patiently. I stopped to think before giving my answer. No, but I would not rule it out just yet. I might end up taking this one in the end. Although I wouldn't be able to get much out of it now, it was possible I would be able to in the future, when my mana reserves grew in capacity. Above all else, it was fun to watch the little airship fly about. Not the main reason for my choice, of course, but I couldn't deny that I wanted to play with it and have it zip through the air. In any case, I suppose I should direct my attention to the other items present. Accompanied by Laura and Isaac, I continued walking through the spacious basement. It seems like there is nothing but junk parts in this area of the room, I muttered to myself as I continued wandering about the Latchell family's basement. Stopping at a corner, I reached out to touch some scattered objects, curious about their purpose. Laura immediately panicked, attempting to stop me. No, you mustn't touch that. Her words were unfortunately a second too late. My hand had already touched the foot of what appeared to be a gigantic pile of scrap parts. Before I knew it, the previously gray part suddenly took on a chromatic gleam. Upon closer inspection, I had touched a magic crystal of sorts. Its mana had previously been completely drained, and it had lost its sheen. With a single brush of the hand, however, the crystal had apparently regained enough power, and it was now glowing dimly. I couldn't see why this was cause for any alarm, for occurrences like this were very common when it came to magical tools. But Laura didn't seem to share my sentiment. "Mr. Vivi, do try your best to hold out for a little while. I will search for the kill switch immediately. It has to be somewhere around here. Quickly." She darted this way and that, frantically searching for something. Confused, I attempted to approach Laura, only to walk headfirst into some sort of obstruction. I stopped in my tracks. I squinted, inspecting the space before me. While it was transparent, it also gave off a faint, magical glow, an invisible wall, born of magecraft and mana. Mages commonly use such spells to protect themselves, much like the shield spell I was fond of using. This kind of spell had many names, often depending on the scale and shape of the wall in question. Withdrawing a small rock from my magical pouch, I gave it a good toss, only to have it bounce merrily in the air, deflected by the shield. By its trajectory, the shield was probably 7 or 8 meters wide, and was shaped like a dome. It would seem like I had been trapped within it. But that in and of itself wasn't exactly a huge problem. If this shield appeared because of me previously touching the crystal, then it would disappear as soon as the mana in the device ran out. Judging by Laura's panicked expression, though, I could tell this was much more serious than just some silly accident. In fact, hey. What is that? The crystal I carelessly touched moments ago had now gathered a collection of objects around it, objects that were moving and pulsating as if they had a life of their own. The objects rearranged themselves this way, and that, soon giving birth to a larger, more coherent form. Looking at its overall silhouette, I understood the resultant item was sizable, to say the least. A golem. Golems were magical puppets of sorts, born from magical techniques or alchemy. They were powered by mana and were capable of independent action even when separated from their creators. Due to these characteristics, golems could be fielded in a variety of ways and could perform a variety of tasks. Unfortunately, the parts required to make golems were costly in general, and few alchemists were capable of creating golems customized to specific tasks. Even so, golems could be seen in some parts of the lands, and they sometimes appeared as enemies in certain labyrinths. They were a familiar sight to most adventurers. In those circumstances, however, the golems would be made of earth or rock, given life by primal magics. These primal golems made up more than half of the golems encountered by adventurers in labyrinths. Golems made of intricate parts didn't appear in less challenging labyrinths. Golems made of iron or steel did exist, and in some rare cases, eyewitness accounts reported similar beings, albeit made with gold or mithril. One would make a small fortune if one successfully defeated such a golem, discounting the fact that it was a fearsome foe. I was in no position to defeat such a golem. What, then, could I make of the being that now stood before me? A high-level disaster of a golem, no doubt, judging from its parts and overall appearance. While I had previously assumed it was made up of scrap parts, I was very much mistaken. The parts comprising its body were none other than the various magical tools Laura had collected. A strange type of rock and sand filled in the gaps in its being, that was what I thought. But this wasn't the case, given this was a dedicated storage room for magical tools. As such, this mysterious substance was neither rock nor sand, but some special material, enchanted by some unknown magic. I had to be adequately cautious with this golem, for a single mistake could be fatal. With a final, solid clank, the room fell silent. It seemed like the golem had finished preparing itself. It was now hardly a gathering of scrap items, but a large, humanoid weapon, armed to the teeth with magical tools of all shapes and sizes. Its arm had several magical cannons attached to it, cannon duramage, as they were called. Its face, if one could call it a face, was similarly constructed, albeit with several thinner magical rifles, commonly known as feuille duramage. Both implements were capable of firing magic-enchanted bullets, from their barrels. These bullets allowed for the instant casting of magic. While ancient and contemporary versions of these tools existed, The ones in the golem were decidedly modern. To top it all off, its hands were armed with all sorts of swords and daggers, makeshift claws, perhaps. It was truly armed to the teeth. To make things worse, none of these weapons were mundane in any way. They were all enchanted magical tools in their own right. If there was ever a personification of violence, there would surely be limits, but this golem paid said limits no heed. I suppose this was why Laura was panicked earlier. If I had the option, I would immediately run. The shield, however, prevented me from doing anything of the sort. All I could do was run around and distract the monster as Laura looked for its kill switch. As I was now, there was nothing else I could possibly do. Greagaf. It was even armed with a mechanism to perfectly replicate a large monster's roar, possibly for intimidating its foes. I wasn't exactly intimidated in any way, but I had no idea what I should do next. The golem didn't seem to care that I was overwhelmed by the situation at hand. With a few thunderous steps, the golem moved, and our eyes promptly met. It seemed like the golem's large size hardly slowed it down, and before I knew it, a fist was soon violently thrown toward me in a sweeping arc. I quickly jumped to the side, barely dodging the blow. The golem's fist impacted with where I had just stood moments ago, crushing the tiles beneath the weight of its blow. If I get hit with that, even I... While I was hoping for my undead nature to be of use in this engagement, I didn't ever recall hearing of an undead coming back to life after it had been minced to bits. Vampires were capable of such techniques, but they were unfortunately unknown to me at this point in time. Either way, I wasn't keen on relying on a still unknown technique. Mr. Vivi, I should be able to find it in the next 3 minutes or so. Please hold on. Isaac, do you remember where it is? Unfortunately not. It should be somewhere in this area. Voices could pass through this shield, and from what Isaac and Laura were saying, it sounded like the all-important device was still eluding their grasp. In that time, I would have to continue avoiding the golem's attacks. I had a lot more to be concerned about in addition to its fists and large body. If I was careless, I could easily be stomped on as well. To make things worse, it was now firing its magical guns and cannons, slinging all sorts of spells in my general direction. Fortunately, those tools didn't seem to be of a very good make, as they either had painfully low accuracy or power. Even so, if any of those spells were to hit a human-sized target such as myself, it would surely be fatal. I couldn't let my guard down.
Damn it.
Is there? Anyway, I could continue dodging and escaping as long as I had the stamina, but my focus would eventually slip. Can I do anything to slow it down? Damage it in some way, maybe? Come to think of it, Lorraine happened to be somewhat of a specialist when it came to golems, being an alchemist and all that. If I recalled correctly, Lorraine said something along the lines of, "Listen here, Rent. All golems have a certain engraving on their forehead, some mystic letters symbolizing the truth. Interestingly, the engraving is but one stroke away from another word, that being death. If you fill in the appropriate stroke, the golem will promptly self-destruct. As such, if you ever do come across such a golem, Rent, look carefully at its forehead." Yes, Lorraine did say something to that effect. As expected of a scholar, she offered truly useful information. I looked up at the golem's forehead. Hey, there's nothing written there. In response to my pitiful monologue, the golem swung at me once more, its large fist flying in my general direction. I had intended to dodge once more, but something caught my eye. In place of a joint, what appeared to be a visible kind of immaterial magic connected the golem's arm to its body. I instead instinctively did the exact opposite of dodging and leaped upward, thrusting my sword into the flickering vigils. With that simple stroke, the golem's left arm promptly fell off its main body, falling lifelessly to the ground. Yes, quite a stroke of luck. Golems felt no pain and wouldn't change their movement patterns to reflect any damage taken. Now that it was an arm short, however, its attacks became easy to predict. If it only had one arm, I'd be able to dodge its attacks indefinitely. Relieved, I relaxed ever so slightly, and it was at this moment yet another of Lorraine's teachings crossed my mind. Well, you may think it is simple, rent, but such a mechanism would only work on a basic golem. To begin with, this function was originally designed by the craftsman to stop a rampaging golem, an emergency kill switch if you would. Recent golems, however, often have an external device paired with it which does the same thing but is commonly found in a separate chassis. This is why you should not be looking only at a golem's forehead, rent. Instead, you should be searching for where its kill switch may potentially be located. Failing that, you could always defeat it with brute force. Yes, of course. Laura was searching for that very device right now.
Ack.
This means there really is nothing I can do. In any case, I had deprived it of an arm. I suppose I could go for its other, or I thought so, at least. The golem, as if reading my thoughts, stared daggers at me. I suppose I should give that idea a rest. For now, escape was the best option. I didn't know how much time passed between then and now. Haha, so you have, finally, cornered me. Thanks to the golem's relentless rampage, its surroundings were reduced to debris and rubble, and standing in the middle of this heap of broken tiles and dust was none other than myself. The golem slowly raised its fist. Have I exhausted every single option?
No.
I still had one more ace up my sleeve. Steeling myself, I infused my weapon with mana. I didn't want to use this technique in front of Isaac and Laura, but I hardly had a choice. Slowly, the golem's fist descended upon me. I raised my sword, ready for the worst. Stop. As Laura's voice rang out across the basement, the golem froze, as if fossilizing in place. In the very next moment, it had stopped moving. At the same time, the magical shield around me faded, and the golem, now no longer able to maintain its form, crumbled into an odd collection of items, dust and rock. It seemed like we made it in time. Almost immediately, Laura and Isaac approached me, and Laura herself stood before me. We took quite a while to find the mechanism in question. If only we had found it sooner. Laura lowered her head in apparent remorse, but none of this was exactly her fault.
No.
I was the one who touched the strange object. In the first place, what exactly was that? I should have asked Laura what the object was before touching it, so no matter how one looked at it, the blame fell squarely on myself. With that, her previously hardened expression softened, a warm smile returning to her face.
Ah, yes.
That is a golem, as you can see. Unlike its more normal relatives, all it would need is a tiny bit of magical power. Once it has that, it will continue absorbing mana from its surroundings, taking in materials of a higher grade than itself. It would eventually become stronger as a result. The shield that encased the both of you was absorbed by the golem, who had used it to entrap you. I do offer my most humble of apologies. What a terrifying weapon. As long as it had an opponent, its surroundings were engulfed in chaos. It is my fault, Laura.
Don't worry
about it. However,
can something like that
be easily made? Well,
no.
It was born from a labyrinth and it cost quite a sum of coin. I suppose there is no other tool like it. A one-of-a-kind magical tool from the depths of the labyrinths. I suppose most items would simply reappear over time. This specific golem, however, had only appeared once. It would be reasonable to assume that Laura would simply purchase any other copy that surfaced. If I had a guess, it was through this research that she declared it unique. On another
note,
are there any other magical
tools
like that in this basement? About that, Laura averted her gaze at my question. I suppose that was a yes. Now, more than ever, did I realize carelessly touching these tools brought about their own brand of danger. What a dangerous basement. Laura, as if understanding my concerns, quickly reassured me. Rest assured, I will be sure to inform you when we are ever next to such an object again. Please do not worry.
Yes.
That would be
much
appreciated. Although that was a sincere response on my part, I couldn't shake the fact that none of this would have happened if I was a little more careful. I should really rein in that carefree attitude of mine. I promptly decided to change the subject. Even so, a golem that absorbs other magical tools and uses them is a truly fearsome creature. The alchemy of the time probably made assembling such a golem possible, but it is indeed difficult for something to integrate and use so many objects at once. The ability to absorb magic from its surroundings is not an ability that most common golems possess. To make matters worse, this basement is full of magical tools that are infused with mana in some way or another, which is why it began moving so quickly. I should really reconsider storing that thing in another facility, Laura said, nodding. Back to the subject at hand, Mr. Vivi. You do not seem injured, so would you like to continue selecting a magical tool? If you are tired, I do not mind seeing you on another day. As Laura said, I wasn't hurt or battered in any way. In fact, it was good exercise. Seeing as to how I still drew breath and was relatively well, I supposed I should continue with the selection process.
No.
I am. Fine. If you are all right with it, Laura, I would like to continue. Honestly speaking, part of the basement seemed ready to cave in at any moment, having sustained significant damage from the battle. But Laura dismissed my worries with a few claps of her hands. Out of nowhere, a small team of servants appeared, and they soon began clearing away the rubble. What surprised me more wasn't the immediate arrival of said servants, but the fact that they were all using magical tools. There are no problems on my end, no. Laura turned to me, smiling. Well, then, shall we continue? We began walking once more, venturing deeper into the basement. And so it came to be that I was able to inspect many magical tools. The sheer variety of the Latchel family's collection impressed me. Other than the model airship, there was the shielding device which had trapped me earlier, as well as a tool that granted one buoyancy. There were also tools for the nullification of all types of poisons, a weapon that crystallized mana into a physical blade, a suit of armor that fought by its master's side as long as it was fed with mana, and even a blowpipe of sorts that launched fireballs at its unfortunate target. To think such tools could even exist. To me, two tools caught my fancy: the little airship and a magical tool that was capable of altering its wielder's voice. The airship was enjoyable, truly, in many aspects. But the latter was a tool that could do my raspy voice some favors. The problem was that I would one day outgrow such a tool. Have you made up your mind? Laura asked, her gracious demeanor hardly dented in the face of my hesitation and prolonged thoughts. I was grateful for her hospitality, but I really was taking a little too long. Unfortunate as it was, and as remorseful as I was, this was an important choice. I had no choice but to accept the circumstances and hope Laura's patience held true. But Laura didn't really seem fazed by my endless deliberation. In truth, I am quite troubled thinking about these choices. Rubbing my chin with a free hand idly, my eyes came to rest on quite a few unusual objects in the basement. I didn't bother hiding my curiosity, posing the question to Laura almost immediately. What is that? Ah, yes. Well, as you can see, Mr. Vivi, that is a monster material. While not magical tools, I am somewhat taken by their intricacies, and I have a small collection of them as a result. I gazed at the objects in question. The amount was by no means small, but perhaps the Latchuels simply had a different sense of scale. The scales of a dragon, a unicorn's horn, the bones of giants. Valuable materials were stacked on top of each other, or stashed into little nooks and crannies here and there. They were all worth a good sum of coin. Truly impressive. I continued inspecting the pile, only to stop at a certain object. Following my line of vision, Laura preempted me with a question of her own. Perhaps that one over there is to your liking? Yes, perhaps. Laura retrieved the item as I nodded, holding it out before me. It was a long, slim, crystalline container with a dark, crimson liquid sealed within its confines. This is a vial of vampire's blood, Laura continued. A material commonly used in the crafting of magical medicines as an alchemical catalyst, or for the crafting of weapons, equipment, and the like. While I can offer no assurance as to if the fluid within is truly the blood of a vampire, that matters little to me as I was more interested in the vessel itself. It is a magical tool that preserves its contents for a long period of time, which was why I picked it up at one auction or another. You do not care about the fluid within. Laura's statement was understandable in light of the Latchel family's tendencies, where magical tools came first and magical material second. Even so, a vampire's blood wasn't a mundane item. Gathering blood from a vampire that had freshly reappeared in a labyrinth was possible, but in most cases didn't happen. If they were left to their own devices, vampires had a tendency to form large and complicated webs of relations, connecting familiars and slaves alike with the power of blood. If a lesser vampire was to evolve any further, the chances of it being easily captured quickly became slim. Matured vampires, in particular, were difficult to discern from normal human beings, and they lived very long lives. Some vampires even wielded positions of immense social power across the lands, and were difficult to deal with. In other words, one couldn't extract the blood of a vampire just because one desired to do so. As such, I couldn't help but be surprised at Laura's dismissive statement. But alas, considering her love and interest for magical tools, this much was to be expected. To me, however, the vial in her hands was worth its weight in gold, possibly a little more. Despite her lack of interest, Laura soon provided a more detailed explanation of the vial's contents. Well, Mr. Vivi, rumor has it the blood of a vampire grants one eternal life if consumed, turning the person in question into another vampire, so to speak. Silly nobles who desire eternal life often purchase such items, and of course, it can be sold to individuals of that nature for a good sum.
A rumor?
Even I had heard of such rumors. If a human being was bitten by a vampire and injected with some of its blood, said human would become a vampire in their own right. Edel was a good example, for he had consumed my blood and had become an existence that was somewhat close to mine. Even familiars were vampires, but I suppose there was some distinction in the classifications that I wasn't aware of. In any case, but the veracity of these claims is debatable. Records of individuals who have imbibed vampire blood do indeed exist, but said records also mention them losing their minds, and in some cases even dying. In other cases, they merely became invalids for the rest of their lives. Even if, hypothetically, there were individuals who succeeded at the venture, no records detailing such events were left behind. After all, vampires are immortals. Who else would openly declare they were vampires to the civilized world at large? A situation I could relate to very well on a personal level, no doubt, seeing as I didn't have a habit of announcing my undead constitution to the general public. Some people particularly close to me were aware of my secret, but even I wouldn't leave records chronicling my evolutionary prospects for posterity, I suppose. Therefore, it is simply a rumor, no more, no less. Even so, when faced with the possibilities of immortal life or becoming an invalid, people seemed willing to take such gambles. At the very least, these individuals seemed to exist no matter the era, which is why this little vial would command quite a respectable price. Laura's tone of voice was visibly scornful, not that I could blame her for such a view. For one reason or another, Laura seemed to think those who sought eternal life so recklessly were nothing more than fools. At least, that was what her demeanor suggested. Was that really true? While I didn't think eternal life was necessarily a bad thing, my more mortal associates would eventually grow old and pass on, leaving me to witness their passing time and time again. Would my heart eventually rot and give out at the loss of all those I held dear? I couldn't deny such a possibility. Even if I lived forever, those around me would still be claimed by death. I suppose I would be sad, but the impact would be small. Small, yes, but repeated twice? Thrice? Hundreds? Thousands of times? I felt a little disillusioned at the prospect of eternal life. If I couldn't return to my previously human self, would such a day eventually come to pass? Would I see Lorraine and Sheila grow old and pass on, their dying moments reflected in these very eyes? It seemed lonely and painful. On the other hand, it wasn't something I could realistically imagine at this point in time. Was having eternal life a blessing or a curse? Until I lived for a long enough time, I suppose I would never be able to tell. I shifted my attention back to the vial of vampire blood Laura had in her hands. For some reason, I was filled with a strong desire. This was the same feeling that overcame me when I had taken a bite out of Lorraine's shoulder, right before my evolution into a thrall. I could chalk up my reaction to a simple desire for blood as sustenance, but I couldn't discount the possibility in my mind. Namely, the possibility that the vial in her hands was exactly what I needed for my next existential evolution. In retrospect, I had defeated quite a few monsters in the swamp of Tarask, and for all intents and purposes, they were strong beasts. But despite the sheer amount of monsters I had slain and the amount of life force I had absorbed, I was still nothing more than a thrall. There was the slight possibility I had simply not slain my fair share, but I had a feeling I wasn't meeting certain conditions that, if met, would herald my continued evolution. Before I had come to this place, I hardly could have imagined what this missing ingredient was. But now, in her hands, a vial of vampire blood. If I consumed that, I would surely evolve, possibly transcending my current state of existence. Was this my instinct at work? The instinct that was pushing me toward this vial was significantly weaker than when I was possessed into taking a bite out of Lorraine. This was perhaps due to my heightened sense of self, in addition to my logical faculties being largely intact. If anything, I wasn't about to be possessed and snatch the vial out of Laura's hands. In any case, I was now sure of what I wanted. I was a creature that sustained itself with blood. Maybe I was just being gluttonous, and that fancy vial made its contents look all the more delicious. I couldn't overlook that possibility. It was also entirely possible that nothing would happen even if I drank the blood, but I suppose that was how possibilities worked. If I let this opportunity slip through my fingers, I would have to capture a vampire in my own time, which wasn't an easy feat. I had little choice in the matter, and thus made up my mind. I would like this. This vial of vampire's blood? You never cease to amaze me with your interesting choices, Mr. Vivi. Laura's eyes opened wide in surprise. It seemed like Laura had assumed I would choose something else, the little airship, I suppose, given how much fun I was having with it. There were also many other magical tools that would have assisted me one way or another, like assorted weapons, tools of convenience, and others. Even if vampire blood could be made into medicines or elixirs, I suppose few would ask for and consume it just to see what would happen. I could sell it, of course, but there were many other magical tools in this basement, some of which would fetch a lot more coin. In light of my personal circumstances, however, this was undoubtedly the most sensible choice. A personal interest of yours, perhaps? Or is there a deeper reason to your choice? An associate of mine conducts research into the biological aspects of monsters. I suppose she would appreciate a specimen like this. This was, without question, a lie. I was referring to Lorraine, and taking her work into consideration, there was some truth in my statement, actually. But there was no way I could tell Laura the truth of the matter, hence my purposefully ambiguous phrasing. Laura seemed to understand there was a deeper meaning to my words. Furrowing her brows momentarily, she stared straight at me for a while, before finally relenting, a smile lighting up her face. Is that right? In that case, Mr. Vivi, I shall grant unto you this gift. You will receive the vessel with it, too. 2 birds with 1 stone, if you think about it. It goes without saying, but I wasn't about to open the vessel and empty its contents before Laura and Isaac. Drinking vampire blood, like it was a potion in front of nobles. The nerve! Still, I couldn't deny I had considered doing it, but the medicine in my hands was something that could turn a normal, functional human being into an invalid should anything go wrong. No normal human would drink it so eagerly, and perhaps not in a single gulp. At the very least, I would like to believe such a human being couldn't possibly exist. I was already strange and somewhat suspicious in terms of appearance, so I had no desire to exacerbate that problem and leave a strange impression upon my hosts. Well then, shall we return to the surface? We have what we came for. I nodded in response. We were soon backtracking, climbing up the spiraling stone steps. While I felt pangs of regret at the little airship I left behind, I had already made my choice. As much as it pained me, I could only give up on the tool, following Laura out of the chamber. If what Laura said was true, the little airship was born from the depths of a labyrinth, so with any luck, I might come across a similar item in my travels as well. I would be hard-pressed to say there would be absolutely no possibility of coming across another one. Endure it, Rent. Endure it with your heart and soul. I dragged my heavy feet reluctantly upward, step after step, as Laura led me further and further away from the little airship that had so captivated my mind. Upon returning to the surface, I was guided to what appeared to be a reception parlor of sorts. As expected, every piece of furniture and decor in this room was first-rate, those being uniquely crafted items made by famous craftspeople and ateliers in the capital that even I had heard of. I even recalled seeing some of these items in famous auctions I had attended before. They were hardly items someone like me could be purchasing, but I had felt that some of these items would look impressive on my mantelpiece. Such a day never did come, and I eventually gave up on the prospect, only to find these very same items in a manor I just so happened to visit. Life was strange in its own amusing way. Well, then, I suppose we should move on to the actual topic at hand. You are, after all, not here to play around, are you, Mr. Vivy? Laura said, seemingly apologizing for having led me on a wild goose chase around the rosehedge maze. I was only here because Isaac asked for me by name, and I didn't sign up to be locked up in some maze and have my efforts observed. Even so, such practices weren't uncommon among nobles, who were fond of testing those they invited to their homes. Even if a close associate claimed a certain adventurer had skill, I suppose it was always more preferable to witness it for oneself. In most cases, the client would request the adventurer or hired hand in question fight a champion of their choice, or to fetch some special item before they were given the actual task. This was by no means an admirable practice. But most of these noble clients had ridiculous amounts of wealth and clout, with the rewards being enough to make even the most seasoned adventurer stand still and gape. To some, there was little to be lost in accepting such a challenge, so such practices were silently and sometimes grudgingly accepted. I had even received a gift from Laura for my troubles, though many nobles tested individuals they hired without reward, with some even haughtily declaring the act of being tested itself an honor. While these clients would no longer have many adventurers to do their bidding for them after the fact, such cases were still heard of from time to time. An adventurer and their client should be on equal standing, as was the view of the guild at large. I would not
Mind.
if you played with me in
Such a fashion again.
In fact, how about I give that labyrinth one more?
Run.
Would I receive another gift for my trouble? Aha! Laura laughed merrily at my cheeky suggestion. You never cease to amuse me, Mr. Vivy. Do you like that little airship so much? There are many other tools that would serve you better, you know. She saw through my silly charade almost instantly. But she wasn't wrong. If Laura really permitted it, I would gladly take on that rosehedge maze again, even if it took the entire day and the next morning. That was how much I wanted the little airship. It is not about if. It is useful. I just desire it greatly. I really want it. That is all. After all, is that not what collecting is about? Laura nodded sagely at my statement. Yes, verily so. To think I would meet a comrade with similar interests in these very halls. But unfortunately, Mr. Vivy, the maze is usually a one-off affair for most, and so, an ancient tradition of the Latchell family, perhaps, or maybe just one of Laura's whims. I didn't know the exact reasons behind it, but I could only assume that an individual conquering the maze multiple times and claiming multiple tools as gifts would eventually empty the vault, so to speak. If that was the case,
No.
the little airship would be forever out of my grasp. The shock to my psyche was immense. It even rivaled the shock I had felt when I realized I would probably forever be a bronze-class adventurer. Such was the magnitude of my disappointment. I felt a deep sense of loss. It was something I usually didn't think of, something that didn't cross my mind. But, the sheer impact of this reality upon my soul, I felt a deep, bittersweet sorrow within my heart.
No, Rent.
You must set your mind upon other things and work toward your goals. Greater, more long-term goals. Or at least I tried. I promptly failed. I was, and still am, in absolute shock. I suppose I looked extremely pitiful to Laura, who was looking in my direction with a mix of compassion and amusement. The little airship is part of the Latchell family's collection, and I do have some personal attachment to it. However, if you desire it so much, there may be certain ways. Laura said, now seemingly disturbed by my apparent obsession. At her words, I slowly raised my head, staring straight at her as I stopped wriggling my fingers. Returning to the subject at hand, Mr. Vivi, Laura continued. You are here today because you have been asked for by name to perform a certain task, that being the regular retrieval of dragon blood blossoms. I suppose you understand that much.
Yes.
However, the client.
Yes.
The client would be Isaac. But surely, you would have already deduced the truth of the matter after meeting me.
Yes.
I understand the true client is you, Laura. If it really was a request issued by Isaac, all he had to do was meet me in person. He could tell Laura the adventurer was here, and there would be no real need for his mistress to speak to me. Isaac could have explained the terms of the agreement. Upon meeting with Laura, however, I immediately understood the nature of the affair. It was just an assumption, for I didn't presume to know the truth by any means, but it seemed like I was largely correct. Laura went on. I consume those dragon blood blossoms well, their extract, if I may say so, at regular intervals. This was why Isaac had been picking them for me in the swamp of Tarask. However, poor Isaac seems to be a little overworked as of late, and as his mistress, I suppose I would like to give him some time off. Laura had a point. To maintain a mansion of this size and regularly brave the swamp of Tarask was no small feat. I could only imagine the burden it exacted upon Isaac and the other servants of the Latchell family. Though, I suppose that wasn't entirely correct. Isaac was the only one who ventured into the swamp, so the burden perhaps rested solely on his shoulders. The manor's maintenance is a Herculean task in its own right, and on top of that, he had to regularly brave the swamp? If I were to make some educated guesses about how the servants did their cleaning, I couldn't even begin to imagine the exact details of such a process. If I take this request, would Isaac be able to rest a little easier?
Why, yes.
Well, Isaac himself is of such an opinion. While he does have quite a lot of work to do here at the manor, I should make it known that Isaac is one of my most capable servants. If you could save him the trouble of exploring the swamp so often, I am sure he would have more time to rest. That is all there is to it, really. Isaac, for his part, remained silent, merely turning to the both of us and nodding at opportune times. I suppose that's fine. I hadn't come all this way wanting to be deeply embroiled in the personal circumstances of the Latchell family, nor should I read too deeply into it. Isaac having a little more time to himself was a good thing, yet completely unrelated to my interests. What was truly important to me, rent fina, was that little model airship. I
see.
If I do this
Task. For you.
then the little airship. I had meant to ask what Laura's views on the matter were, but she seemed to have already made up her mind. If you accept the task, then yes, Mr. Vivi. You may have the little airship. Of course, this has no impact on the original sum of coin we have agreed upon in the contract. Rest assured, your reward is intact, so to speak. Really? I was unable to believe what I had just heard. Yes, Laura said. Well, to begin with, the swamp of Tarask is quite a challenge even for the most seasoned of adventurers, is it not? If it would motivate you to give it your all, Mr. Vivi, then something like that would be a small price to pay. Something like that? Why, that airship would command a small fortune if sold. Such was its worth. To dismiss it as if it were nothing but small change. How bold, how audacious. I could feel nothing but a deep sense of gratitude toward Laura. It permeated my body and soul. At this moment, I, rent fina, was willing to pledge my eternal and unwavering loyalty to this young lady. But of course, that was unnecessary. I suppose, if one bothers asking, one can find good deals, I said, attempting to obfuscate the fact that I was over the moon at this arrangement. I wonder if Laura saw through my charade. While she looked young, The sheer ferocity of logic that dwelled in her eyes painted her as a sensible adult. The wisdom in her gaze almost suggested a bloody history of battles waged against various heads of powerful merchant families and nobles who owned entire continents. I wondered how many challenges one had to overcome to reach such a point in life, and what experiences were needed for such a feat. I could hardly imagine it. Taking all that into consideration, I didn't have a single doubt in my mind. Laura had already read my mind through and through. She was an upstanding lady in her own right, only suggesting to gift me with the little airship after watching me fidget and gripe endlessly. In fact, I did a poor job at hiding my joy. I could soon hold it in my hands once more. Even so, Laura calmly watched on, not saying a word. This wasn't childish behavior. Or I didn't think it was. Adventurers were the sorts of individuals to use whatever means possible to grasp what they sought, even if those means were a series of childish conducts aimed at having their host take pity upon them and grant them the object of their desires. You truly are a pathetic individual, Rent Fina? But no, I couldn't refuse. I had to have it. Oh, little airship. You are mine and mine only. I would never give you to anyone. Well, jokes aside, but was that truly a joke? Perhaps, but truly, jokes aside, I turned to Laura, continuing our conversation. Laura seemed a little troubled as the conversation went on. Although any silver-class adventurer worth their salt would not have trouble retrieving the flowers, the journey there poses certain issues, as I am sure you are aware. Certain clothing and equipment would not survive the trip, in addition to the ever-present threat of poison. With some poisons being slow-acting, it can be difficult to predict and prepare for such occurrences. And then there are the Tarasques. Yes, they can be generally avoided if one carries holy water with them, but there are also cases where individual monsters become incredibly aggressive due to turf wars among their kind. Considering all this, I really wanted to hire a gold-class adventurer, but alas, one would have to make a trip to the capital for such an appointment. Each and every one of Laura's points made perfect sense. Although adventurers who were capable of all the above existed, they wouldn't be found in a rural town like Malt, no matter how wealthy or powerful the client. I, in turn, would be quite a rare find to the Latuels, for it just so happened my abilities matched what they were looking for, and hiring me would be mutually beneficial. A convincing line of reasoning, but there was something that caught my attention. I understand your points. I am not against accepting the request. However, the fact that you need to consume dragon blood blossom extract on a regular basis, perhaps, Laura, you suffer from accumulative miasma disease. Laura seemed taken aback, surprised at my question. You know of the name of this disease, Mr. Vivi? Then, the reason you ventured into the swamp in the first place. I wanted to answer Laura's question, but I had an obligation to keep my client's private information secret. I could tell her I had taken on a request of a similar nature, though I couldn't divulge any more details than that. And yet, Laura had reached quite the deduction with what little information she had of me, another demonstration of the Latuel's influence over Malt. Should they ever desire any kind of information, it would surely make its way to them via one channel or another. Be that as it might, I would still stand by my principles.
That
is all I can say. Laura seemed to understand the meaning behind my words. I do apologize. It would seem like I have overstepped my bounds. With this, however, I am sure you understand my circumstances, Mr. Vivi. While the accumulative miasma disease can be treated permanently in its early stages with the extract of dragon blood blossoms, the disease can no longer be cured once it reaches a terminal stage. I would not suddenly die of it, but in exchange, I do require fresh dragonflower blood on a regular basis. Hence my request. I nodded at Laura's words. Should I ask her to say any more, I would be the one overstepping her boundaries. I didn't know all that much about the accumulative miasma disease to think it would become permanent at a later stage. Sister Lillian of the orphanage was lucky to have been cured this early. A single trip to pick some of the blossoms was one thing, but regular trips for a constant supply was another matter altogether. I suppose I may have really done it this time, taking on a request of such magnitude. In any case, I now understood Laura's circumstances and had a good grasp of the request at hand, in addition to the proposed rewards. Accepting this request didn't seem out of the question, and, yes, the rewards were quite charming. I turned to Laura, my mind made up. I will accept this request, but I would like the documentation to be altered to reflect the updated terms that we have agreed on
Just now.
if that is all right with you, Laura. Or perhaps I should say, honored client. I stuck out my hand, and Laura promptly took it in her own, smiling. Most obliged. You would be doing us a great favor. I look forward to working with you from now on, Mr. Vivi. Yes, and you may continue to call me Laura. I had intended to treat Laura with an additional layer of formality after the contract was mutually agreed upon, but it seemed like that wasn't necessary.
I
Understand, Laura. Is this fine? At my words, Laura's smile widened ever so slightly and she nodded, seemingly satisfied. Was that really all right? I asked of Isaac as he walked next to me, slowly escorting me toward the manor's gates. Yes, she does not quite mind. It is something to be given away eventually, and it made little difference as to when it left her hands. At least, that was what Lady Laura had to say. Isaac's eyes focused on the same thing as mine, that of a small airship flying through the air. Due to the strength of my mana only keeping it airborne for 10 minutes or so, Laura infused the magic crystal within it with some magic of her own, enough to keep it flying for an hour and maybe a little more. Honestly speaking, the crystal itself was quite the prize and was more than adequate as a reward. To the Latchuels, however, both the airship and the crystal seemed like pocket change. As for Laura herself, she was now resting in the manor. Isaac was the only one accompanying me to the gates. Of course, I was no child, and the youth within me wanted to protest, or at least to say that I required no escort. Alas, the rose hedge maze stood between myself and Malt. I would only get lost in it again. Now that I knew the secrets of the maze, I could use the method I had previously discovered, though it would still take me quite a bit of time. I would be done by the next sunrise, maybe.
But I had Isaac with me.
As he approached, the very walls of the rose hedge maze seemed to come alive, arranging themselves this way and that to form a clear path for us. It was almost like the maze itself chose to avoid Isaac and, by extension, me. What trick is there to this strange mechanism? As if responding to my query, Isaac held out his hand, slowly unfurling his fingers. Resting in his palm was what appeared to be a round rock of some sort. It had a familiar appearance. Come to think of it, it looked somewhat similar to the remote device that was paired with my model airship. Isaac soon offered an explanation. If one holds this and focuses adequately, one is able to reshape the garden to their liking to a small degree at least. It would be impossible to perform any major changes. Major changes? How would one go about doing something like that? Only Lady Laura knows how it is done. I am not privy to the specifics, so to speak. I couldn't possibly know if Isaac was telling the truth, but, for now, that mattered little. It was wise to keep it a secret, lest individuals with ill intent attempt to use the maze for their own ends. I wasn't about to tell everyone at the tavern the Latchell family secrets, as rumors wouldn't spread if one remained adequately discreet. Isaac's decision was sound. It would seem like we have reached our destination, Isaac said as we stopped before the manor's gates. Having the little airship land on the ground, I gave its side a small tap. As if responding to my gesture, it minimized itself, contracting in size. With this, I could hold it comfortably in the palm of my hand. This was one of the many functions Laura had so kindly told me about, and while it had many other hidden functions, I wasn't sure if I would ever have the chance to try them all out. It being able to enter a more compact form was convenient at the very least. I didn't exactly want the airship hovering about me in Malt, nor did I want to carry its fully deployed form while on my errands. The gate guard is no longer here.
Yes.
He stands guard from dawn to dusk. At night, the gates are locked, and the maze becomes extremely complex to ensure no one enters the premises, Isaac responded. Personally, it was already a difficult maze, So if it became any more complex than it already was, any unfortunate individual who wandered in would surely be trapped well into the next day. A truly frightening prospect. I have a question. What should I do on future visits? If possible, I really wanted to steer clear of that maze, especially since I wouldn't be able to pick a second gift. Isaac seemed a little surprised, as if he meant to tell me before but had apparently forgotten during the course of our short conversation.
Ah, yes.
If the guard is present at the time of your visit, he will contact the manor, upon which I will personally make my way here to escort you in. Rest assured, Mr. Vivi. Reassuring response. With that, I gave Isaac a polite wave, walking down the path and leaving the manor's gates behind. The next time I visited these grounds, I would arrive with dragon blood blossoms. It was a melancholic feeling, having to enter the swamp again. If anything, I was now equipped with the high-quality holy water that Isaac had gifted to me. It can only get easier from here on out. Is this it? Yes. That was all we said as we sat, arms folded, in Lorraine's living room. On the table was a singular object, a crystalline vial, housing what appeared to be a crimson-black fluid. Our eyes were fixated on it, and, for a while, neither of us broke the silence. The vial was none other than the vampire's blood I had received from Laura the day before. Although I had given Lorraine a summary of what had transpired at the Latchel Manor that day, she was somewhat tired and sleepy, which resulted in us postponing the discussion to today. When I had asked after her out of concern this very morning, Lorraine informed me she had gone a little overboard with her research and studies. Curious, I asked what these topics that kept her awake were, only to learn she had been doing research and writing textbooks in preparation for Alizé's eventual magic lessons. She could have easily purchased a commercial textbook of sorts, but Lorraine was known for being overly enthusiastic when it came to certain matters. She apparently insisted on making her own teaching materials, and that was that. Although she spent quite a while on the text, it would seem like Lorraine had finished what she set out to do. One would assume creating something as specialized as a magic textbook would take a long time, but it turned out Lorraine was only noting down the basics of magic and magecraft, and as such it didn't take all that long. According to Lorraine's ambitions, the series was to eventually comprise of 10 volumes, each detailing various theses on the applications of magic. If you read them all, you, too, would become a magical scholar. Rent was apparently the inspiration behind the sheer length of her work. One wonders how a simple conversation on why Lorraine had decided to teach a local orphan the ways of magic spiraled into this, but of course, I had no answers myself. Alizé had mentioned she wanted to become an adventurer, but what would happen if she followed Lorraine's teachings and became a scholar instead? I suppose that wouldn't be a bad thing, for if she did become a good, renowned scholar, she, too, could afford a laze about like Lorraine did, if only because of the amount of coin she would be earning on a regular basis. At the very least, the hypothetical scholar Alizé would be much more well-off than me, a bronze-class adventurer. Not a bad career choice at all. If Alizé did eventually move on to study at an academy or school, she might even win a national scholarship. Even if Lorraine was just an oddball scholar living in a rural town on the fringe of Yaran's borders, a recommendation from Lorraine could go a long way. But Alizé wanted to become an adventurer. I reminded Lorraine of that fact, and of how she was my very first disciple, which, predictably, led to a silly argument between us. In the end, we both settled on the fact Alizé was the one who would ultimately make the decision. But for some reason, I felt Lorraine would entice her onto the path of scholarhood should I ever leave her unattended. I decided to impart unto Alizé all the joys, hopes, and dreams of adventuring, all in good time. Even if mistakes were to be made along the way, there was always the arguably inspirational tale of the man who had spent 10 years stuck as a bronze-class adventurer to tell. In any case, I turned my attention back to the vial of vampire blood on the table. One might ask why I chose this of all things, but, of course, it was done for the sake of my existential evolution. For some reason, I felt like a great change would come over me if I absorbed this into myself. Or at least it felt that way. So, you are telling me it is something like instinct, Rent? Lorraine asked, casting a sideways glance at me. I thought for a little bit before giving my answer. I don't really.
No.
For example, a child wants to play with an interesting object because it looks interesting. One sleeps because one is
Sleepy.
It was such a feeling. It wasn't entirely identical as far as feelings and hunches went. To be precise, it was something akin to an urge. An urge I didn't feel when I was still human. But I couldn't express it in any other way, hence my choice of words. Well, I cannot say much to that, Rent. After all, there is no arguing against instinct. However, you have considered the risks, yes? As that Laura Latchell associate of yours said, vampire blood is known to be a risky treatment for anything, really. I have read many records of those who attempted such a thing. All of said attempts ended in tragedy, mind you. It is not something you should put to your lips without the appropriate mental preparation. Lorraine had a point. I hadn't exactly conducted much research on vampires. To begin with, vampires were quite highly ranked as far as monsters went and wielded formidable strength. I didn't come across such creatures easily, nor had I ever stood in front of one. While I had some basic knowledge of vampires in that regard, having a good grasp of what would happen to people who drank vampire blood was something that was out of my general expertise. Lorraine, however, seemed to have some knowledge on the matter, as expected of a scholar. With Lorraine warning me about the dangers involved, I felt my resolve wavering ever so slightly. Maybe I should give up on that for now and
Just
play with this instead. Saying so, I withdrew an ornamental, disc-like rock from my pouch, placing its control device in my hands. The model airship, which had been placed gingerly in the middle of the table as if it were a priceless treasure, was soon floating and zipping around in the air. You really did take home quite a lot of rare artifacts, no? Even I have not heard of this Latchell family, Rent. Just by looking at the magical tools they own, however, I can say with confidence they are by no means a normal family. Lorraine's eyes transfixed on the little model airship. Shifting my consciousness to the airship, I stared down at Lorraine, who had an amusing expression on her face. If I had to say, it was a mix of admiration and exasperation. It would seem like I had moved the airship a little too close to Lorraine. Come to think of it, I had never been this physically close to her before. In fact, upon closer inspection, Lorraine was wearing somewhat looser clothing today. This is a bad angle little airship. I'm almost able to see certain things I shouldn't be seeing. I recalled my consciousness from the little flying craft, taking a deep breath as I did so. I hadn't yet informed Lorraine of the airship's functions, so she probably shouldn't have noticed anything untoward happening. However, Lorraine tilted her head to one side, as if confused. What is it? No, it is nothing. Perhaps it was just my imagination. No, nothing at all, Lorraine said, giving a strangely vague answer to my seemingly innocent question. As if changing the subject, Lorraine continued. Even so, have you decided what you would do once you have stopped escaping from reality, Rent? You said it was necessary for your evolution, no? In that case, you would eventually end up drinking it either way. I suppose. You are right, but I cannot help but feel a little scared at the thought. Do you not have any thoughts about me just drinking this, Lorraine? Of course, if you do not intend to drink it, then that would be that, Lorraine answered seriously, without any hint of hesitation. I do not mind if you remain undead forever, Rent. You could continue staying here, fulfill whatever requests that catch your fancy, and keep living in Malt. Not exactly a bad prospect. But Lorraine continued after taking a deep breath. You dislike that, Rent. That is not what you want, even I know that. I know all about your dreams. No matter what, even if you had no talent, and even if it took years upon years, you would keep aspiring to become a mithril-class adventurer, yes? Even if you had to grab the metaphorical tiger by the tail and pull off some death-defying stunts, you would walk that path without hesitation all the way to the end. In fact, is this hesitation that you show me not just an act of concern? That is the kind of man you are, Rent Fina. Am I wrong? If so, then I will support you however I can. Ha! If it comes down to it, I'll pick up your bones, bury them in a proper grave, and I would even visit every day. Until the day I die, I'll make sure your silly grave is not forgotten. I would cry as loudly as I could at your funeral, but alas, that is about the extent of what I can do for you, Rent. As expected of Lorraine, she truly understood me. It was true. Although I seemed to hesitate a little, it was all but an act. I had already made up my mind a long time ago. If drinking this would turn me into an invalid, or somehow kill me a second time, then that would be that. If I didn't drink it, I would never be able to take that step forward, and my life would just be a parody of living a dead man walking, so to speak. Figuratively, of course. The fact that I was literally a dead man walking didn't escape my attention, but for now, I chose to let that thought lie. But even so, should such an incident come to pass, it would surely be a handful for Lorraine to deal with. I apologize. If I drink this and end up doing anything strange, you should conjure up your
spells
and burn me to a crisp. I pray it does not come to that, Lorraine muttered, her response almost sounding like a prayer. I nodded at Lorraine, finally taking up the crystal vial in my hands. For a while, I stared into Lorraine's eyes, which even now seemed to be filled with unease and maybe a slight hint of fear. I twisted the vial's knob off, raised it to my lips, and tipped its contents into my throat.